A quiet welcome to Restful Historian. Tonight, we begin a gentle journey through the entire story of the Roman Empire. No rush, no noise, just a slow walk through time. And like all great stories, this one begins not with armies or emperors, but with a quiet myth of two brothers and a city born by the river. Before we dive in, if you find value in these stories, perhaps take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe. You can also let me know in the comments where you're listening from and the time. Now, find a comfortable position, dim the lights, or maybe turn on a soft fan for background noise, and let's ease into tonight's story together. In the earliest twilight of Roman memory, long before its legions marched or its laws shaped the world, there lived a story, not etched in stone, but whispered through generations by hearth and lamplight. It begins not in Rome, but in Troy, with a prince named Aeneas. After his city was consumed in fire, Aeneas carried his household gods across the sea, guided by omens and sorrow, to the western lands of Italy. There, through hardship and time, his descendants would sow the seeds of a new people. Generations passed, and from this noble line came the birth of twin brothers, Romulus and Remus. Their beginning was marked by cruelty. Abandoned as infants on the soft banks of the river Tiber, they were left to die by an order rooted in fear. But fate had other plans. A she-wolf, wild and sacred, discovered the helpless infants and nursed them beneath the sheltering mouth of a cave known as the Lupercal. It is a symbol so deeply etched in Roman soul, a beast of instinct raising the bearers of civilization. Later, a shepherd and his wife took the boys in, raising them among the hills and woodlands. As they grew, they became leaders among their peers, fierce and clever, shaped by nature and necessity. Eventually, they came to know their origins, and with that knowledge, a vision was born, to found a new city. Yet as with so many beginnings in Roman history, this one too was stained by blood. A dispute over omens and boundaries, over who would lead and where the city should rise, turned deadly. Romulus struck down his brother, and from that fratricide, a city was born. He named it after himself, Roma. It was a name that would echo across continents and centuries. And so, from divine ancestry, wild nurture, and tragic ambition, Rome took its first breath, not as an empire, nor even a republic, but as a myth, cradled in both destiny and sorrow. Though Rome's birth was wrapped in legend, the world it emerged into was unmistakably real, a land of rivers and hills, of shifting alliances and patient growth. As the fires of myth began to cool, Rome evolved from a sacred boundary on the Palatine Hill into a living community nestled among 7 gentle rises. These hills, Palatine, Capitoline, Aventine, Celian, Esquiline, Quirinal, and Viminal, became home to a tapestry of Latin-speaking peoples. They were farmers, shepherds, craftsmen, and warriors who worshipped household spirits, honored ancestors, and lived in tight-knit clans. Alongside them were the Sabines and other Italic tribes, whose languages and rituals gradually mingled with the Latin core. Daily life was simple but bound by custom and duty. Small shrines dotted the land. Markets slowly took root at the junctions of dirt paths. Rome, still little more than a village, was already learning to unify the diverse. But even in its infancy, Rome was not isolated. To the north stood the Etruscans, an older, more refined civilization whose stone cities and ornate temples spoke of long history. Their influence seeped into Rome like ink on parchment. They taught the Romans to build arches, to pave roads, to mark time with sacred calendars. Etruscan kings ruled over early Rome, bringing order and ceremony to its institutions. From them came the purple robe, the curule chair, and the fasces, symbols of authority that would endure for centuries. Meanwhile, from the southern shores, Greek colonies in Magna Graecia introduced writing systems, mythology, and philosophy. The Latin tribes absorbed it all, never imitating completely, but shaping borrowed ideas into something unmistakably Roman. In this quiet blend of cultures, from the rustic Latin hearth to the dignified Etruscan ritual, the foundation of Rome's identity was laid. It would become a city of bridges, between tribes, between gods, between the known and the imagined. And though it had not yet raised its banners or marched its armies, it had already learned its most enduring trait, to gather the strengths of others and call them its own. As Rome began to solidify from scattered settlements into a unified community, its earliest leaders emerged not from elected office, but through the ancient concept of kingship. These kings, known more from tradition than from exact history, ruled not merely as sovereigns, but as sacred figures, guardians of law, ritual, and expansion. According to Roman lore, there were 7 kings who reigned between the city's mythical founding in 753 BCE and the establishment of the Republic in 509 BC. Their stories blend fact with fable, but together they form a kind of moral and cultural foundation for what Rome would become. First among them, of course, was Romulus, the founder. After killing his brother Remus, Romulus became the city's first king, establishing not only its name, but its institutions. He is said to have created Rome's first legions, assembled the Senate, a council of elders drawn from leading families, and offered asylum to outcasts and fugitives to populate his growing city. In one of the earliest myths of unification, he invited the neighboring Sabines to a festival, during which Roman men seized Sabine women as wives, an event remembered not just for its violence, but for how the women themselves, later, helped forge peace between the two peoples. Romulus reigned for many years before, according to legend, he vanished into a storm and was taken by the gods, becoming the deity Quirinus. He was succeeded by Numa Pompilius, a Sabine by birth, known for his wisdom and piety. Where Romulus brought structure and power, Numa brought peace and spirituality. He is said to have built temples, formalized Rome's religious calendar, and introduced the Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of Rome, a role that would one day be held by emperors themselves. His reign laid the spiritual rhythm of Roman civic life, aligning the people not just under law, but under the watch of the gods. Next came Tullus Hostilius, who broke with Numa's peaceful ways and turned Rome once more to war. He conquered Alba Longa, a neighboring Latin city, and in doing so helped centralize Roman authority across the region. But he was also said to be impious and met a strange end, struck by lightning, a warning from the gods, some said, for his disregard of ritual. Following Tullus came Ancus Marcius, who sought balance between war and peace. He built Rome's first prison, the Mamertine, and expanded the city to the Aventine Hill. Most notably, he constructed the first bridge over the Tiber, the Pons Sublicius, connecting the city to lands and peoples beyond. Then came a shift in lineage. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, the first of 3 Etruscan kings, took the throne. He increased the number of senators, improved Rome's military, and began monumental public works, including the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer system that would help tame the marshy lowlands. His rule brought wealth, and Rome began to resemble a true city. After him came Servius Tullius, a king of humble origins, possibly born a slave, but remembered for reform. He reorganized Roman society by wealth and military obligation, creating a structure where landowners had voting rights based on their contributions. This Servian constitution laid the groundwork for future political organization. He also expanded the Pomerium, the sacred boundary of the city, and fortified the hills, giving shape to a Rome that looked outward with strength. Finally, there was Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquin the Proud. His reign was marked by cruelty, arrogance, and the abandonment of tradition. He ruled without the Senate's consent, executed rivals, and used fear to maintain control. Yet even under him, Rome grew. He completed the grand temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, a site that would become sacred for centuries. But it was not war or oppression alone that ended the monarchy, it was dishonor. Tarquin's son, Sextus, violated Lucretia, a noble Roman woman, and her suicide, born of shame and injustice, sparked a revolution. Led by Lucius Junius Brutus, the Roman people rose, overthrew the king, and vowed never again to suffer under one man's unchecked power. The monarchy was abolished, and in its place, the seeds of the republic were sown. Thus ended the era of kings, not with quiet succession, but with fury and resolve. Yet their legacy remained. The Roman kings laid the foundations: religion, military tradition, urban infrastructure, and civic identity. The republic would build upon these stones, reshaping power, yes, but never forgetting where it had come from. The end of the Roman monarchy did not arrive with old age or slow reform. It came like a storm, swift and irreversible, born from dishonor and a deep, collective sense of injustice. The last king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, had already strained the patience of the Roman people. He was proud, harsh, and dismissive of tradition, having seized power through violence and ruled with disdain for the Senate and the customs of his predecessors. His reign had not been without achievement. Great temples rose, public works expanded, and Rome's military remained formidable, but his tyranny made those accomplishments feel hollow. The final spark, however, was not political, but deeply personal. His son, Sextus Tarquinius, committed an unforgivable act. While staying as a guest in the home of a nobleman, he forced himself upon Lucretia, a virtuous and respected Roman matron. Shamed and broken, she summoned her family, spoke the truth of what had happened, and then, before their eyes, took her own life, not as an act of weakness, but as a solemn protest against dishonor. Her death became a rallying cry. The Roman people had tolerated arrogance, had endured hard rule, but this was different. It struck at the heart of Roman virtue: pietas, honestas, and fides, duty, honor, and trust. Led by Lucius Junius Brutus, a relative of the king who had long hidden his own ambition beneath the guise of simplicity, the citizens of Rome rose. They did not simply demand that Tarquin leave. They overthrew the very idea of kingship. For the first time in their history, the Romans declared that no man should ever again hold absolute power. They abolished the monarchy in 509 BCE, marking what they believed to be a turning point not just in their own lives, but in the course of civilization itself. In its place, they created a new structure, the residential publica, meaning the public thing. Instead of one king, 2 consuls would be elected each year, sharing authority and limiting each other's power. The Senate, once a mere advisory council, became central in guiding state affairs. Laws would be debated, not dictated. Magistrates would serve for limited terms, accountable to their peers and the people. And though the new republic would still favor the aristocratic class, the patricians, it introduced a principle that would grow over time: that the people, the populus Romanus, had a voice in their governance. It was not yet a perfect system. Power remained concentrated in the hands of elite families, and struggles between rich and poor would soon rise. But in that moment, Rome had done something rare and profound. It had turned its back on kings, not out of chaos, but from principle. It had chosen the harder path of shared power and civil responsibility. And for centuries to come, Romans would look back on this moment with pride, telling and retelling the story of Lucretia, of Brutus, of the fall of the Tarquins, as a founding legend not of conquest, but of liberation. Thus, the monarchy ended not with a whimper, but with a vow that Rome would never again kneel to one man. That vow would be tested, bent, and eventually broken, but in 509 BC, it lit a new torch, the beginning of the Roman Republic, an experiment in civic virtue, public service, and the balance of power, whose influence still echoes in the halls of modern democracies. With the monarchy now cast into memory, Rome stood at a delicate crossroads, a city no longer ruled by kings, yet not quite a democracy. It was a republic, a residential publica, a public matter, where power would no longer rest in the hands of one man, but would be shared, distributed, and debated. The Romans, deeply marked by the tyranny of their last king, were careful in how they built their new government. It would be layered and complex, not for the sake of confusion, but to ensure that no single individual could rise too high again. At its core stood the Senate, an assembly of elder statesmen, the seniors, originally drawn from noble families. Though technically an advisory body, the Senate held immense weight. It did not pass laws but gave senatus consulta, recommendations that shaped Rome's path. The senators were the keepers of tradition, of ancestral wisdom, and of Rome's long memory. They debated foreign policy, oversaw financial matters, and guided the conduct of magistrates. Over time, their influence only deepened, becoming the true engine behind Roman statecraft. Executive power, however, was given to two consuls, elected annually by the citizens. These consuls acted as co-leaders, sharing equal authority in both civil and military affairs. They commanded Rome's armies, presided over the Senate and assemblies, and represented the state in religious ceremonies. But their power was checked by time, by one another, and by tradition. They could serve only 1 year at a time, and each had the power to veto the other. It was a system born from distrust of monarchy, one that forced cooperation and discouraged tyranny. And when crises struck, the Senate could appoint a dictator, a single man with absolute power, but only for 6 months, and only in emergencies. Even exceptional authority had a built-in expiration. Below the consuls were a series of magistrates, each with specific duties: praetors to oversee justice, aediles to manage public works and festivals, quaestors to handle finances, and censors, appointed less often, to review the Senate's roles and oversee public morals. These roles were filled by citizens, rising through a structured ladder of public service known as the cursus honorum, the path of honors. It was not merely a career, it was a lifelong journey of duty, sacrifice, and rising prestige. But governance was not limited to elite offices. Rome's early republic also depended on its popular assemblies, the voice of the people. These were gatherings of Roman citizens who voted on laws, elected magistrates, and decided matters of war and peace. There were multiple assemblies, each structured differently: the comitia centuriata, organized by wealth and military class, which elected consuls and passed major laws, and the comitia tributa, based on tribal divisions, which handled lesser magistrates and civil matters. While these assemblies gave citizens a role, their power was heavily weighted in favor of the wealthy and well-armed. The rich had more votes, the poor fewer, a reflection of Rome's belief that those who bore more responsibility in battle should have more influence in peace. And so, the early republic took shape, not as an ideal democracy, but as a carefully balanced structure designed to keep ambition in check while preserving Rome's unity. It was built on duty, tradition, and an evolving sense of shared governance. And though it would soon be tested by internal conflict and the growing pains of expansion, this system, with its Senate, consuls, and assemblies, laid the framework for centuries of Roman resilience. Though the Roman Republic was founded on the rejection of kingship and the embrace of shared power, its earliest years were anything but equal. Beneath the elegant balance of consuls, senate, and assemblies lay a deep divide between the patricians, the aristocratic families who claimed descent from the city's founders, and the plebeians, the common people who made up the vast majority of Rome's population. The patricians held the wealth, the land, and the sacred offices. They dominated the Senate, filled the magistracies, and claimed sole authority over the rites and rituals of the state. The plebeians, meanwhile, worked the fields, served in the legions, and paid the taxes, yet they had no meaningful voice in the laws that governed them. In times of war, they fought. In times of peace, they endured. But as the years passed, their frustration grew, not in fiery rebellion, but in slow, determined resistance. The first great moment of protest came in 494 BCE, in what Roman historians would later call the first secession of the plebs. Facing crushing debt and little legal recourse, the plebeians withdrew from the city en masse. They marched to the sacred mount outside Rome and refused to return until their grievances were heard. It was a quiet but powerful act, not with violence but with absence. Without its working class, Rome could not function. The Senate, recognizing the crisis, agreed to concessions. Thus was born the tribunate of the plebs, a new political office reserved for plebeians, with the sacred right to veto actions that threaten the people's interests. These tribunes became protectors of the poor, inviolable by law and accountable only to the plebeians who elected them. But this was just the beginning. Over the next 2 centuries, the plebeians would slowly chip away at the walls of patrician privilege. In 451 BCE, after continued pressure, Rome codified its laws on the 12 Tables, the first written laws of the Republic. Until then, legal judgments were made orally by patrician judges, often interpreted in ways that favored the elite. With the 12 Tables displayed publicly in the Forum, all citizens could finally know their rights and obligations. It was a small but profound step toward transparency. The struggle continued. The plebeians demanded access to the highest offices of power. For years, only patricians could serve as consuls. But after decades of tension and reform, plebeians eventually won the right to hold the consulship, and later, even the dictatorship in times of emergency. Intermarriage between patricians and plebeians, once forbidden, was legalized. The priesthoods, once closed, began to open. With each hard-won right, the Republic inched closer to the idea that power was not the birthright of the few, but a shared trust among all citizens. By the early 3rd century BCE, the conflict of the orders, as it came to be known, reached a turning point. The Lex Hortensia, passed in 287 BCE, declared that decisions made by the plebeian council, the Concilium Plebis, would be binding on all citizens, patrician and plebeian alike. It was, in effect, the formal recognition of the plebeians' equal political standing. Rome had not become a democracy in the modern sense. Wealth and class still mattered greatly, but it had achieved a remarkable balance for its time. A republic where commoners could rise to power, influence law, and shape the future of the state they defended. This long and patient struggle was not simply a social conflict. It was foundational to Roman identity. The plebeians did not overturn the republic, nor seek to destroy the elite. They worked within the system, expanded it, and transformed it. And in doing so, they made Rome stronger, a republic not of a single class, but of layered voices, bound by law and driven by the belief that the state existed for the people, not the other way around. With its internal structure slowly solidifying, the Senate advising, the consuls commanding, the plebeians slowly gaining their voice, the Roman Republic began to look outward. Rome had started as a small settlement among many, but its ambitions grew with every passing generation. Yet Italy was far from peaceful. It was a patchwork of independent tribes and proud city-states, each with its own customs, languages, and gods. And to become anything more than a local power, Rome would need to prove itself not just in the Forum, but on the battlefield. The earliest and most natural rivals were the Etruscans to the north, the very people who had once ruled Rome and shaped its early culture. These city-states, such as Veii, Tarquinia, and Clusium, were wealthy and well-defended. For decades, Rome clashed with them, most notably in the bitter and prolonged war against Veii, which lasted nearly 10 years and ended in Roman victory around 396 BC. The fall of Veii marked more than a territorial gain. It was a psychological turning point. Rome had not just survived an enemy, it had absorbed a rival civilization. It began to station colonies, build roads, and secure alliances, laying down the first threads of a wider network of influence. But far to the south and east, in the rugged highlands of central Italy, lay a more formidable challenge: the Samnites. Proud, fiercely independent mountain warriors, the Samnites controlled much of the interior. Between 343 and 290 BC, Rome and the Samnites would fight 3 separate wars, each more brutal and complex than the last. These Samnite wars were not just contests of force, they were tests of endurance, adaptability, and will. In narrow valleys and rocky passes, the legions met resistance unlike anything they had faced before. At the Battle of the Caudine Forks, Rome suffered a humiliating defeat, forced to pass under a yoke of spears, a symbolic surrender burned deep into the Roman soul. But Rome learned from its mistakes. It restructured its military, adopted more flexible tactics, and used its greatest strength, infrastructure, to extend roads and supply lines into the heart of Italy. In time, the Samnites were subdued, their independence broken, but not their memory. They remained etched in Rome's military mind as one of the most dangerous foes ever faced, not for their numbers, but for their defiance. And then from the north came terror, swift, chaotic, and unforgettable. In 390 BC, a band of Gauls, fierce warriors from beyond the Alps, descended upon Italy and approached the walls of Rome itself. The Romans met them at the Battle of the Allia and were disastrously defeated. The city was left undefended, and for the first time since its founding, Rome was sacked. Flames licked the rooftops. Statues were broken. Temples desecrated. Only the Capitoline Hill held out, a last redoubt of resistance as the rest of the city was overrun. The trauma of that moment left a scar that never fully healed. From that day forward, Rome would live with the memory of vulnerability, a quiet fear that would fuel an obsession with security, expansion, and fortification. When the Gauls finally accepted a ransom and withdrew, Rome vowed it would never be caught unprepared again. Woe to the vanquished, the Gallic leader is said to have declared, and Rome, in its quiet rage, took those words to heart. These early wars, against Etruscans, Samnites, and Gauls, were more than just campaigns for land. They were crucibles in which the Roman character was forged. Rome learned to adapt, to build not just armies but roads, alliances, and colonies. It discovered that resilience could be greater than strength, and that defeat could be a better teacher than victory. By the early 3rd century BCE, Rome had become the most powerful force in Italy, not because it was always the strongest, but because it was always the last to fall. And with the peninsula nearly united, Rome now looked beyond, across the seas, to new rivals, and to wars that would shape the world. By the beginning of the 3rd century BCE, Rome stood at a quiet but remarkable threshold. What had begun as a village on a hill, born of myth, shaped by kings, tested by neighbors, had now emerged as the dominant force in central and southern Italy. The long and often painful wars against the Etruscans, the Samnites, and the invading Gauls had taught Rome not only how to fight, but how to endure. And it was endurance, not brilliance in battle, nor genius in diplomacy alone, that allowed Rome to slowly draw the entire Italian peninsula under its influence. Yet conquest alone was never the full story. What set Rome apart was how it incorporated those it defeated. Instead of destroying their enemies outright, the Romans offered a complex web of treaties, alliances, and conditional citizenship. Some cities were granted Latin rights, a form of partial citizenship that allowed for intermarriage, trade, and even eventual integration. Others became municipia, local self-governing communities under Roman oversight. Still others, especially those who had proven loyal in war, were offered full Roman citizenship, with access to Roman courts and, in time, even the vote. This was not benevolence, but strategy, a masterstroke of long-term thinking that turned former enemies into invested partners in Rome's success. Rome also expanded its network of roads and colonies, a quiet revolution that often did more to secure loyalty than legions ever could. Roads like the Via Appia, begun in 312 BCE, linked Rome to its distant territories, making troop movement swift, trade efficient, and communication possible across great distances. Colonies, small outposts of Roman citizens and veterans, were planted like seeds across Italy. They served not just military functions, but cultural ones. Roman language, law, and customs spread with them, and soon even the most remote parts of Italy began to echo with Roman speech and ceremony. Temples to Roman gods appeared where once stood local shrines. Roman markets replaced older trade hubs. Local elites were co-opted, given Roman names, Roman privileges, Roman ambitions. And yet, this unification was not without resistance. Some regions, like the Greek cities of southern Italy, resisted Roman rule fiercely. The city of Tarentum, feeling threatened by Roman presence, called upon the great Hellenistic general Pyrrhus of Epirus to aid them. Pyrrhus arrived with war elephants and a modern army, and for a time he brought Rome to the edge of defeat. But his victories came at terrible cost. So costly, in fact, that even success felt like failure. These Pyrrhic victories, as they came to be known, wore down his strength. Eventually, Pyrrhus withdrew, and one by one, the Greek cities fell under Roman control. By 265 BCE, with the conquest of Volsinii, the last independent Etruscan city, Rome had achieved what no one before it had: control over the entire Italian peninsula from the Po River in the north to the Strait of Messina in the south. It was not a rigid empire, but a mosaic, a collection of cities, tribes, and communities tied together not just by force, but by law, infrastructure, and the promise of shared destiny. And this unity, hard-won and carefully managed, would serve as the launching platform for Rome's next phase. The Republic had mastered Italy. Now it would look beyond, across the blue waters of the Mediterranean, to a new and formidable rival, Carthage. The wars that followed would not just define Rome's future, but shake the ancient world to its core. With the Italian peninsula united beneath Roman influence, the Republic had grown from a regional power into something more ambitious, organized, and increasingly aware of its place in the wider Mediterranean world. But as Rome looked outward, it found the sea was not empty. Across the waters to the southwest lay a rival, old, wealthy, and powerful. This was Carthage, a city of Phoenician origin, founded centuries earlier on the coast of North Africa. Carthage was not a land empire like Rome. It was a maritime power, a city that lived by the sea, traded across it, and ruled it with fleets of sleek warships. Its harbors were filled with merchants, its markets with silks, spices, and silver, and its navy was unmatched in the western Mediterranean. Where Rome had grown from fields and farms, Carthage had grown from commerce and the sea. Their worlds were different, but they were now on a collision course. That collision came over Sicily, the large, fertile island at the toe of Italy. In 264 BCE, a local dispute between two small groups in the Sicilian city of Messana drew in both Rome and Carthage. What began as a limited intervention quickly spiraled into something far larger. Neither side could back down without appearing weak. And so began what would become the First Punic War, a 23-year struggle between two titans that neither had truly expected, but neither could afford to lose. At the start, Rome was at a clear disadvantage. It was a land power. Its strength was in legions, not ships. Carthage, by contrast, ruled the seas with a navy built over generations, with experienced sailors and advanced ship design. But Rome, as always, adapted. Captured Carthaginian ships were studied and copied, reverse-engineered by Roman craftsmen to produce an entire fleet in record time. And with these ships came a new invention, the corvus, a boarding bridge that allowed Roman soldiers to turn naval battles into infantry combat, their strength brought onto unfamiliar water. It was not elegant, but it was effective. The war saw a series of brutal engagements, off the coasts of Sicily, near Sardinia, and even along the shores of Africa. Rome suffered defeats, shipwrecks, and storms, but each setback brought lessons. Sicily, once a prize, became a grinding theater of siege and counter-siege. Cities changed hands. Armies starved, but Rome never relented. In 256 BCE, the Romans even launched an ambitious invasion of Africa itself. Though the campaign faltered, it showed Rome's growing reach and its refusal to accept limitations. Carthage, for its part, relied heavily on mercenaries, Numidians, Iberians, and Gauls, fighters drawn from across its empire. These troops were fierce, but loyalty wavered with payment. Rome, by contrast, fielded citizens and allies, men who fought not just for money, but for their homeland and honor. That difference, subtle at first, became more pronounced as the war dragged on. Finally, in 241 BCE, after over 2 decades of exhausting conflict, the two sides clashed in a final, decisive naval engagement off the Aegates Islands. The Romans, better trained and now with superior seamanship, defeated the Carthaginian fleet. With no way to resupply their forces in Sicily and their economy drained by war, Carthage sued for peace. The war ended with Carthage surrendering Sicily, its first and most precious overseas holding. It agreed to pay heavy indemnities over time, and Rome, for the first time, took possession of land beyond the Italian mainland. Sicily became Rome's first province, governed not as a partner or ally, but as a subject territory. A new era had begun. Rome had stepped onto the imperial stage. But the peace was uneasy, and resentment simmered. Carthage, humiliated and burdened, would recover. And in time, it would strike back, not by sea, but by land, and with a general whose name would become eternal, Hannibal. Not long after the peace of the First Punic War, Carthage, though weakened, had begun to heal. It had lost Sicily and paid dearly in gold, but its ambitions had not vanished. They had simply turned elsewhere. With Rome watching the western Mediterranean, Carthage looked to the land, to the rich territories of Spain, known to them as Iberia. There, the Carthaginians established a new base of strength, building cities, recruiting soldiers, and securing mines of silver to fund their recovery. And at the heart of this rebirth was a young general, brilliant, bold, and fiercely loyal to his people. His name was Hannibal Barca. Hannibal had been raised with a singular purpose. As a boy, he was said to have sworn an oath to his father, Hamilcar, that he would never be a friend to Rome. He learned the art of war not in lecture halls, but in the dusty fields of Iberia. By the time he took command, he already commanded deep loyalty from his troops, a mixed force of Iberians, Libyans, Gauls, and Numidian cavalry. When Rome challenged Carthage's growing presence in Spain, citing a treaty as justification, Hannibal did not respond with words. Instead, he laid siege to Saguntum, a Roman ally. War was declared, and with it began the Second Punic War in 218 BC. But Hannibal did not take the expected route. He did not sail across the sea to face the Roman navy. Instead, he chose the unthinkable. He would march his army overland through the Pyrenees, across southern Gaul, and finally over the Alps, the towering, snow-covered spine that separated northern Italy from the rest of Europe. It was a journey of unimaginable hardship. Ice, altitude, avalanches, and hostile tribes claimed lives and slowed progress. But Hannibal pressed on, and when he emerged from the mountains, frostbitten and reduced in number, he had achieved something no one believed possible. He had brought war to the doorstep of Rome. What followed were some of the most devastating defeats in Roman history. At the Battle of the Trebia River, Hannibal lured Roman forces into a trap and crushed them. At Lake Trasimene, he ambushed a marching Roman column in thick morning fog. The destruction was near total. But his most famous victory came at Cannae in 216 BC. There, Hannibal faced a Roman army twice his size. Using tactical brilliance, he arranged his troops in a crescent formation, drawing the Romans in, surrounding them, and enveloping them completely. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers died that day. It remains one of the greatest tactical feats in military history. Panic spread through Rome. Allies in the south began to defect. The Senate, though shaken, refused to negotiate. Instead, Rome turned inward. It rebuilt, reorganized, and changed its strategy. No longer would they seek direct battles with Hannibal. Instead, they avoided him, cutting off his supply lines, re-establishing loyalty among wavering cities, and buying time. For over a decade, Hannibal remained in Italy, undefeated, yet unsupported, unable to strike at the capital itself. The Romans knew patience could be its own form of strength. The tide turned with the rise of a young Roman general, Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Scipio Africanus. Rather than chasing Hannibal, Scipio struck at Carthage itself. He sailed to Africa, drawing Hannibal home to defend his city. In 202 BCE, at the Battle of Zama, the two great commanders met at last. This time, it was Rome that adapted. Scipio used Hannibal's own tactics against him, neutralizing his war elephants, breaking his lines, and securing a decisive victory. Carthage sued for peace once more. The terms were harsh. Carthage was stripped of its empire, forced to pay enormous tribute, and forbidden from waging war without Rome's permission. Hannibal, though respected by his enemies, would spend his remaining years in exile, a hunted man, too dangerous to be left in peace, too proud to beg for mercy. The Second Punic War, which lasted from 218 to 201 BCE, changed everything. Rome had survived its darkest hour, and in doing so, had become something greater. No longer merely the master of Italy, it now stood as the dominant power of the Western Mediterranean. But in victory, Rome had also learned something deeper, about fear, resilience, and the cost of ambition. And though Carthage was not yet dead, it now lived in Rome's shadow, its fate sealed not by peace, but by quiet resentment and the long memory of defeat. As the long shadow of Hannibal stretched across the Italian countryside, darkening cities and draining morale, Rome found itself battered but not broken. Year after year, Hannibal remained in Italy, undefeated in open battle, but unable to deliver a final blow. He marched across the land, forging alliances, unsettling Rome's authority, but still the city stood, stubborn, fortified, unyielding. The Roman Senate, cautious and grim, shifted to a war of attrition, avoiding pitched battles and focusing instead on cutting off Hannibal's support. It was a strategy of patience. Wise, perhaps, but not inspiring. The people hungered for hope, for someone who would bring not just survival, but victory. And in this time of need, a name emerged quietly, first whispered in the ranks, then spoken with growing confidence. Publius Cornelius Scipio. He was young, unusually so for command, and came from a family already touched by the war. His father, also named Publius, had died fighting in Spain, one of Rome's many attempts to sever Carthage's grip on the region. Scipio had been only a boy when Hannibal had first invaded, but he had already shown signs of rare courage. According to legend, he had saved his father in battle at the Trebia. Whether true or not, the story carried weight. The image of a young man facing death for duty was exactly the kind of figure Rome needed. By the time he was granted command in Spain, Scipio was still in his mid-20s, lacking official rank but not resolve. The Senate gave him limited authority, more out of desperation than trust. But what he lacked in age, he made up for in vision. In Spain, Scipio began to reveal the depth of his brilliance. He studied Carthaginian tactics, learned from Hannibal's maneuvers, and began to reshape the Roman way of war. At New Carthage, a critical stronghold in southern Spain, he launched a bold surprise assault, scaling the city's defenses from the sea during low tide, an act of daring that shocked both his enemies and allies. The city fell, and with it, Carthage's influence in much of Iberia began to collapse. But Scipio did more than fight. He governed. He treated captives with respect, restored local rulers, and built alliances. Where Hannibal had won with terror and swift strikes, Scipio won with diplomacy, discipline, and a sense of destiny. In time, all of Carthage's holdings in Spain fell, and Rome's influence stretched farther than ever before. But even as he achieved these victories, Scipio's thoughts drifted elsewhere, to Africa. He believed that to defeat Carthage, Rome could not simply chase Hannibal in Italy forever. It had to strike at the heart. The idea of an African campaign was bold, even reckless in the eyes of many senators. But Scipio had learned to think beyond convention. He returned to Rome and sought support. At first, the Senate was hesitant, cautious of repeating past mistakes. But Scipio had become popular, with the people, with the soldiers, and with those who had grown tired of fear. They granted him authority to carry the war into Africa. Scipio landed in North Africa with a hardened army, many of whom had faced Hannibal's brother, Hasdrubal, in Spain. He quickly allied with Numidian princes who had long resented Carthage's influence. Chief among them was Massinissa, whose cavalry would prove invaluable. Scipio moved swiftly, defeating Carthaginian forces near Utica and threatening the city itself. Carthage, now truly alarmed, called for Hannibal's return. After more than a decade in Italy, the great general left the land he had ravaged for so long, called back to defend his homeland in what would become the war's final act. The stage was set for the legendary Battle of Zama, but Scipio's rise was already complete. He was no longer just a general. He was a symbol of Rome's resilience, its ability not just to endure defeat, but to learn from it and to rise stronger than before. Where Hannibal had been forged in hatred, Scipio had been shaped by response. Every step of his journey a reaction to disaster, refined into brilliance. He carried not just the weight of his command, but the hopes of a republic that had waited too long for triumph. And as the dust of Africa began to swirl and Hannibal marched to meet him, the world held its breath. Two minds, alike in genius, opposed in allegiance, were about to clash. And in that final moment, it would not be just the fate of Carthage or Rome that hung in the balance, but the direction of Western history itself. Years passed after the Second Punic War, but the wound between Rome and Carthage never fully healed. Carthage, though humbled and stripped of its empire, survived. It rebuilt its economy, restored its cities, and flourished once again as a commercial hub. It honored the terms of its treaty with Rome, paid its tributes dutifully, and posed no threat on the battlefield. Yet to many Romans, especially those in the Senate, Carthage's resilience was unsettling. They had not expected the city to rise again, not with such grace or strength. Whispers of suspicion grew, fueled by the memories of Hannibal's rampage through Italy, memories that Rome could neither forget nor forgive. In the shadows of power, one voice rose louder than the rest, a man named Cato the Elder. He ended every speech, regardless of its subject, with the same chilling phrase, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. The pretext for war came not from Carthage, but from its neighbor, Numidia, now a Roman ally under King Massinissa. Massinissa repeatedly encroached on Carthaginian territory, confident that Rome would not intervene. Carthage, unable to defend itself without Roman permission, appealed to the Senate for justice. But Rome remained silent. Finally, pushed too far, Carthage broke the treaty and took up arms, not against Rome, but against Numidia. This breach, small and desperate though it was all the Roman hawks needed. War was declared. The Third Punic War had begun. But this was not a war of armies and open battlefields. It was something darker, a siege designed not just to conquer, but to erase. In 149 BC, Roman legions crossed the sea and surrounded Carthage. The Carthaginians, realizing too late the depth of Rome's resolve, surrendered thousands of weapons and ships. But even that was not enough. The Romans demanded the unthinkable. that the people of Carthage abandon their city and rebuild it inland, far from the sea that had given them life. The Carthaginians refused. Carthage, the city that had once ruled the western Mediterranean, that had fought Hannibal's war with such tenacity, would not die begging. The people fortified their walls, armed their citizens, and prepared for the last stand. The siege lasted 3 years. Inside the walls, the people starved. Families melted down statues to make weapons. Women cut their hair to string bows. Every street became a barricade, every home a fortress. The Roman commander Scipio Aemilianus, grandson by adoption to the great Scipio Africanus, led the final assault. In 146 BCE, Roman forces breached the walls. What followed was not battle, it was devastation. The city burned. The population, once in the hundreds of thousands, was slaughtered or sold into slavery. Temples crumbled. Statues were toppled. According to some accounts, the Romans plowed the fields with salt so that nothing might grow again, though this may have been more legend than fact. What is certain is this: Carthage ceased to exist. Rome had not just defeated its greatest rival, it had erased it. What had begun as a contest for Sicily had become a saga of vengeance, paranoia, and eventual obliteration. The destruction of Carthage marked the end of the Punic Wars, but it also marked the beginning of a new Roman era, one of dominance, empire, and unchecked ambition. And as the flames of Carthage flickered into the night, and the cries of a ruined people faded into memory, Rome stood alone, the undisputed master of the Western world, both feared and admired. But in destroying its enemies so thoroughly, Rome had done something irreversible. It had not just ended a war, it had silenced a voice. And in that silence, a new kind of power began to rise, one that would shape the very fate of the Republic itself. With Carthage reduced to ashes and the Western Mediterranean firmly under Roman control, the Republic stood at a height it had never known before. Its legions were seasoned by decades of war, its admirals had conquered the seas, and its enemies, those who had once been feared, were either dead or bowed. Yet Rome was not content with stability. The habits of expansion had become part of its very character. And so, even as Carthage's ruins still smoldered, Rome's eyes turned eastward, to the ancient lands of Greece and beyond, where wealth, legacy, and new threats awaited. Greece, once the cradle of philosophy and art, had long since fractured into rival kingdoms and leagues. Macedon, the homeland of Alexander the Great, still held power, though diminished. Some Greek states clung to independence, others to Roman alliance. But the balance was delicate. In 146 BCE, the same year Carthage fell, Roman legions crushed the city of Corinth, the cultural gem of the Greek world. The destruction was swift and brutal. Temples looted, citizens enslaved, art carried away to adorn Roman villas. It was not just a military victory, it was symbolic. Rome, once the pupil of Greek culture, now declared itself its master. Greece was absorbed, first as provinces of Macedonia and Achaia, and though its philosophers would continue to influence Roman thought, the autonomy of the Greek world was gone. Further west, Spain, or Hispania as the Romans called it, had never truly settled after the Second Punic War. The Iberian tribes were fierce and independent, defending their mountain strongholds and forests with a spirit the Romans found both frustrating and strangely familiar. One man in particular became a symbol of resistance: Viriathus, a Lusitanian shepherd-turned-warrior, who waged a brilliant guerrilla war against Roman forces in the 140s BC. He used speed, terrain, and ambush to keep Roman generals at bay. Though eventually betrayed and killed, his memory endured as a rare Iberian hero. In response to such resistance, Rome tightened its grip, establishing colonies, building roads, and stationing permanent forces. By the end of the 2nd century BCE, most of the peninsula was under Roman control, not as equal allies, but as conquered subjects. But it was in the East, in the lands of wealth, incense, and ancient thrones, that Rome would find both triumph and temptation. After the death of Alexander the Great, his vast empire had fractured into successor kingdoms. One of the most powerful was the Seleucid Empire, which stretched across much of the Near East. Rome, seeing both opportunity and obligation, began to involve itself more directly in the region. Battles were fought not only with spears, but with diplomacy, as Roman envoys stirred tensions and brokered alliances in their favor. In 190 BCE, at the Battle of Magnesia, Roman forces defeated the Seleucid king Antiochus III, curbing his influence in Asia Minor. In the years that followed, more territories were annexed or absorbed, sometimes through war, often through the wills of kings who left their lands to Rome in hopes of peace or favor. One such gift came in 133 BCE, when the king of Pergamon, a wealthy Hellenistic state in modern-day Turkey, bequeathed his kingdom to Rome, an entire realm surrendered not by force, but by pen. And so, quietly, steadily, the Republic became an empire in all but name. Provinces sprang up across the map: Macedonia, Achaia, Asia, Hispania Ulterior and Citerior, each governed by Roman magistrates sent from the capital. Wealth poured into the city: gold, slaves, grain, marble, and manuscripts. Triumphal parades filled the streets, with generals hailed as saviors and conquerors. Yet beneath the applause, cracks were beginning to show. The spoils of conquest did not reach all Romans equally. The rich grew vastly richer, their estates expanding across the countryside, often worked by the increasing numbers of enslaved peoples brought in from abroad. Small farmers, once the backbone of the Republic, were driven from their land, unable to compete. Cities swelled with the dispossessed, while the Senate grew more insulated and indifferent. The age of conquest had brought glory, yes, but also deep imbalance. Rome had conquered the world, but in doing so, had set the stage for a new kind of war, not against foreign enemies, but between citizens themselves. And as generals began to gather more loyalty than the Senate, and the streets grew louder with the voices of the restless and the poor, a new chapter of crisis and civil strife began to unfold. As the legions returned from far-off lands and the banners of triumph fluttered above the city, Rome gave the appearance of prosperity. But behind the marble facades and victorious parades, something quieter and more dangerous was spreading: inequality. The great conquests had filled the treasury, but they had also reshaped the very bones of Roman society. The countryside, once dotted with the farms of citizen soldiers, men who had tilled the soil and fought in Rome's wars, now lay in the hands of a few wealthy families. These aristocrats had bought up abandoned plots, stitched them into vast latifundia, slave-run estates, and profited enormously from cheap labor and large-scale agriculture. Meanwhile, the smallholder farmers, away fighting Rome's endless wars, returned home only to find their lands sold, their homes lost, and their place in society diminished. They drifted to the city, not in triumph, but in search of survival. Rome swelled with the landless poor, veterans and peasants alike, who sought bread, shelter, and work in a system increasingly unprepared to help them. The Senate, filled with patricians who benefited from this transformation, showed little urgency to reform it. And so, into this growing chasm between rich and poor stepped two brothers, idealistic, brave, and fated to be remembered not just for their proposals, but for their tragic ends. Their names were Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. Tiberius Gracchus, the elder, was elected tribune of the plebs in 133 BC. He was well-born, a patrician by heritage, but his sympathy lay with the dispossessed. What he proposed was radical, though rooted in old law: to redistribute public land, the ager publicus, back to the poor, giving landless citizens a chance to rebuild their lives and once again serve in the military. He believed that a strong Rome required strong citizens, and strong citizens needed land. But the Senate, seeing their estates threatened, reacted with fury. Tiberius bypassed their authority, turning to the popular assemblies to pass his reforms. For this, he was accused of tyranny. In a moment of rage and fear, a mob of senators attacked him during a public meeting, clubbing him to death in the shadow of the Capitol, the first political murder in the history of the Republic. Yet the movement did not die with him. A decade later, Gaius Gracchus, younger and more fiery, took up his brother's cause. As tribune, he expanded the agenda: grain subsidies for the poor, judicial reforms to limit senatorial corruption, new colonies for land distribution, and citizenship rights for Rome's Italian allies. Gaius was more eloquent, more daring, and as a result, more dangerous to the elite. His policies gained immense support among the common people, but again drew the wrath of the Senate. Tensions escalated. Riots broke out. And in 121 BCE, the Senate issued a decree, the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, effectively declaring martial law. Gaius fled to the Aventine Hill. There, cornered and abandoned, he fell upon his own sword. His body was never recovered. Thousands of his supporters were killed in the aftermath. The deaths of the Gracchi marked a turning point. Political violence, once unthinkable, had now become a tool. Reformers would think twice before challenging the Senate. But the problem they had tried to solve, the gulf between rich and poor, the erosion of the small farmer, the swelling of the urban poor, remained and grew worse with each passing year. The Republic had proven unable to heal itself peacefully. It had silenced dissent with blood. And in doing so, it had set a precedent that would echo again and again in the century to come. After centuries of steady conquest, the Roman Republic stood taller than ever, but its foundations were beginning to crack. Though its armies had stretched across continents, and its wealth had grown beyond anything the early Romans could have imagined, something vital had been left behind. At the heart of the crisis lay the land, and the people who no longer owned it. The conquest of distant provinces had flooded Rome with spoils, but it had also changed the very shape of society. As legions marched abroad, many small farmers, called away to serve, returned to find their plots seized, degraded, or swallowed up by wealthier landowners. The land, once the sacred bond between citizen and state, had become concentrated in the hands of a few. These elite families transformed rural Italy into sprawling estates known as latifundia, worked not by Romans, but by an ever-growing population of enslaved captives from war. The rustic, self-reliant farmer, the backbone of the early republic, was disappearing. As these displaced citizens streamed into the capital, Rome began to swell in all the wrong ways. The streets grew crowded with the landless and jobless. Bread became scarce, housing tighter, and dignity harder to come by. And as the poor filled the city, the Senate remained distant, clinging to tradition and privilege. The Republic was no longer ruled by farmers and citizen soldiers, but by aristocrats who had little reason to reverse the tide. It was in this environment of deepening inequality and deafened leadership that two brothers rose to speak for the forgotten, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. Tiberius Gracchus, elected tribune of the plebs in 133 BCE, was not a man of the mob, but a member of the elite himself. Yet his eyes were open to the suffering around him. With passion and principle, he proposed a return to an old law, limiting the amount of public land a person could hold and redistributing the excess to the poor. His goal was not revolution, but restoration, to rebuild the Roman middle class, strengthen the army, and revive civic virtue. But the Senate, whose fortunes were tied to the very estates he sought to limit, reacted with fury. Tiberius bypassed them, appealing directly to the people. For this defiance, he was accused of seeking kingship, the most dangerous accusation in Roman political life. In a horrifying moment on the Capitoline Hill, Tiberius and dozens of his supporters were clubbed to death by a senatorial mob. It was the first political murder in the Republic's history, and a wound that would never fully heal. Years later, Gaius Gracchus took up his brother's cause. He was more organized, more visionary, and perhaps even more dangerous to the old order. Elected tribune in 123 BCE, Gaius proposed wide-reaching reforms. He renewed land redistribution, established grain subsidies for the poor, restructured courts to reduce senatorial corruption, and extended rights to Rome's Italian allies. He tried to reshape Rome into something more inclusive. But his ambition alarmed the Senate. When tensions boiled over into riots, the Senate passed an emergency decree, effectively giving itself license to use force. Cornered and abandoned, Gaius fled and died by suicide. His body was never recovered. Over 3,000 of his supporters were executed in the violent aftermath. The story of the Gracchi is not just a tale of reformers and resistance. It is the moment the Republic crossed a threshold, when politics turned from debate to bloodshed, when violence became acceptable in the name of order, and when the dream of a balanced republic began to dim. The brothers had tried to warn Rome of the growing chasm between rich and poor, between citizen and senate. In silencing them, the Republic had preserved the old order, but at a terrible cost. The questions they raised remained unanswered, and the tools used to destroy them would be used again, in darker and more dangerous hands. The land was still broken. The people were still angry. And Rome, though it did not yet know it, had begun its long descent into civil war. In the years after the deaths of the Gracchi brothers, Rome did not find peace. The issues they had died trying to address, landlessness, inequality, and political corruption, continued to fester. But the tragedy of their end had taught a bitter lesson. Change would no longer come through law alone. The old structures of the Republic, so proud and intricate, were no longer enough to contain the ambitions and tensions building beneath the surface. Now, power would increasingly reside not in the Senate or the assemblies, but in the army, and in the hands of the men who commanded it. One of the first to truly reshape Roman politics through military strength was Gaius Marius, a man of humble origins who rose to become one of the most influential figures of his age. Born into an equestrian family near Arpinum, far from the patrician circles of the Senate, Marius built his reputation through determination, discipline, and battlefield success. In 107 BC, he was elected consul, a rare honor for a new man, someone without noble lineage. He promised to reform the army, to make it more efficient and better suited to Rome's expanding needs. And in doing so, he would alter the Republic forever. Traditionally, only property-owning citizens could serve in the legions, tying military duty to land and stability. But Marius opened recruitment to the landless poor, offering not only pay, but promises of land after service. This created a new kind of soldier, loyal not just to Rome, but personally loyal to their general, the one who led them, paid them, and would reward them. It was a quiet but seismic shift. Soldiers no longer marched just for the Senate and people of Rome, they marched for Marius. His reforms paid off quickly. Rome was under threat from Germanic tribes, the Cimbri and Teutons, who had defeated Roman forces and caused panic in the north. Marius reorganized the legions, trained them relentlessly, and in a series of dramatic battles, crushed the invaders. For this, he was hailed as Rome's savior. He was elected consul an unprecedented 7 times, each time promising stability and strength. But his growing dominance stirred unease, and his alliance with the populace, the political faction favoring the common people, made him enemies among the conservative optimates. Among those enemies rose a new figure, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, an aristocrat and skilled general in his own right. He had served under Marius in the campaigns, but their alliance fractured over time, driven by jealousy, politics, and conflicting visions for Rome's future. The spark came when Sulla was awarded command of a major campaign in the east, but Marius, leveraging political allies, had the decision reversed. Sulla responded not with debate, but with something Rome had never seen before. He marched his legions on the city of Rome itself. It was 88 BCE, and with the thunder of hobnailed boots, Rome witnessed the unthinkable, a Roman army entering the city not to defend it from foreigners, but to fight other Romans. Sulla declared Marius an enemy of the state, seized control, and left for his eastern campaign. Marius fled into exile, only to return a year later when Sulla was away. The city was taken again, this time by Marius and his supporters, who unleashed a brutal purge of Sulla's allies. Marius died shortly after, old, victorious, but broken by the violence he helped unleash. When Sulla returned, it was with vengeance. He crushed his opponents and in 82 BCE became dictator, a position meant for short emergencies, but which he held indefinitely. His rule was marked by prescriptions, published lists of enemies whose lives and property were forfeit. Hundreds were executed. Lands were confiscated. The Senate was filled with his supporters. And though he eventually stepped down voluntarily, claiming to have restored the Republic, the damage was already done. The idea that armies could determine Rome's politics was no longer shocking. It had become precedent. Marius and Sulla were not merely generals. They were heralds of a new age, where personal loyalty replaced public duty, where reforms were written in blood, and where ambition no longer hid behind modesty. The Republic, still intact in name, had begun to hollow. The balance of power had tipped. And in the generation to come, even greater men and deeper wars would rise from the chaos they left behind. As the Roman Republic matured, its victories multiplied, and so too did its internal contradictions. With each conquest, the Senate grew wealthier, the elite estates expanded, and the legions returned home from distant provinces not to a republic of balance and order, but to a city whose foundations were beginning to creak under the weight of change. And in this world, of growing inequality, of landless veterans, of deepening disillusionment, power slowly shifted away from the old patrician institutions. No longer was Rome ruled solely by its laws or by the authority of the Senate. Now, it began to bend toward those who could command armies. The age of generals had arrived, and with it, the quiet unraveling of the Republic. One of the first great figures of this new age was Gaius Marius, a man who rose not from the patrician class, but from the plebeian ranks, a new man from the small town of Arpinum. Lacking noble lineage but overflowing with ambition, Marius climbed the political ladder through sheer ability and a growing reputation as a brilliant soldier. His military victories in North Africa, particularly in the war against Jugurtha, earned him fame and the support of the common people. But Marius was more than just a general. He was a reformer, and the change he ushered in would ripple for generations. In a bold move, Marius opened the legions to the landless poor, offering them not only pay but also the promise of land upon retirement. This reformed the Roman army into a full-time profession, but it also subtly rewrote a vital bond. Roman soldiers, once loyal to the Republic and its ideals, now owed their futures, their livelihoods, to the generals who led them. Their loyalty began to shift from Rome itself to the man who promised them security. Marius' military genius was tested when Rome faced existential threats from migrating Germanic tribes, the Cimbri and Teutons, whose crushing victories had brought fear even to the capital. Marius reorganized the Roman legions, drilling them with ruthless discipline, arming them with standardized equipment, and teaching them to build, march, and fight as a single, deadly force. He won decisive victories, especially at Aquae Sextiae and Vercelli, saving Rome from disaster and elevating himself to near-mythic status. For this, he was elected consul 7 times, an unheard-of honor in a system built to prevent lifelong dominance. But his success drew rivals, and his alliance with the populace, those who sought reform and appealed to the common people, began to split the Republic down factional lines. Into this divided world stepped another towering figure, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, an aristocrat of ancient blood, but no less ambitious. Unlike Marius, Sulla was cold, calculating, and steeped in the values of the optimates, the conservative senatorial elite. He had once served under Marius, but their partnership quickly soured into rivalry. When war broke out in the east against Mithridates VI of Pontus, the Senate awarded command to Sulla. But Marius, using political maneuvering, had the decision overturned. What followed was unprecedented. Sulla marched his army on Rome itself, not against foreign invaders, but to seize control of the capital from fellow Romans. It was 88 BCE, and for the first time in the Republic's long history, a Roman general had used military force to resolve a political dispute within the city. The spell was broken. The Republic's sacred boundaries had been crossed. After driving Marius into exile and securing his command, Sulla left for the east. But as he campaigned abroad, Marius returned, old but vengeful, leading a brutal purge of Sulla's allies. The streets of Rome ran red with blood. Marius died shortly after, but the cycle of retaliation had begun. When Sulla returned victorious in 82 BCE, he took the city once more, this time with even greater vengeance. He declared himself dictator, a position intended only for emergencies, and used it to reshape the Republic in his image. Sulla's rule was marked by terror and reform alike. He published lists of enemies, proscriptions, men whose names marked them for death, whose properties were seized, and whose families were ruined. Yet alongside the bloodshed, he also attempted to strengthen the Senate, limit the power of the tribunes, and restore what he believed was the proper aristocratic order of Rome. After enacting his reforms, Sulla did something astonishing. He resigned, retiring to a private life, convinced that he had saved the Republic. But what he had truly done was teach future generals that power came not from tradition or law, but from the legions. The road had been paved, not for stability, but for Caesar, for Pompey, for civil wars to come. The Republic had survived Marius and Sulla, but it had been forever changed by them. No longer did Rome's future lie in the hands of senators and citizens alone. It now rested on the swords of soldiers, and the will of the men who commanded them. By the middle of the 1st century BCE, the Roman Republic was a republic in name only. The Senate still met, consuls were still elected, and laws were still passed. But behind the rituals of governance, true power was slipping into the hands of men with armies, money, and charisma. None would wield those forces more completely, or more fatefully, than Gaius Julius Caesar. Born in 100 BCE to a patrician family with modest political standing, Caesar was ambitious from the beginning. But unlike the cautious senators of old, his ambitions were shaped not by moderation, but by vision. He moved through Roman politics with a quiet confidence and a growing following, aligning himself with the populares, the faction that spoke to the people's needs rather than the Senate's traditions. In 60 BC, Caesar formed a political alliance with two of the most powerful men of the age, Pompey the Great, a celebrated general, and Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome. This unofficial trio, known to history as the First Triumvirate, used their combined influence to dominate Roman politics. Caesar secured a consulship and afterward a military command in Gaul, a vast and restive region beyond the Alps. It was here, on the frontiers of civilization, that Caesar would build his legend. The Gallic Wars, fought between 58 and 50 BCE, transformed Caesar from a shrewd politician into a titan of history. Through a series of brilliant campaigns, he subdued tribe after tribe, using a combination of daring maneuvers, ruthless efficiency, and keen psychological insight. His commentaries on the Gallic War, written in clear, concise Latin, not only recorded his exploits but served as masterful propaganda, painting him as both protector of Rome and noble conqueror. His most famous victory came against Vercingetorix, a charismatic Gallic chieftain, at the siege of Alesia. Encircling the enemy with one set of fortifications and defending against reinforcements with another, Caesar achieved a feat of engineering and strategy that left even his enemies in awe. By the time he was done, he had added all of Gaul, modern-day France and Belgium, to the Roman world. He had also grown wealthy beyond imagination and earned the undying loyalty of his legions. But as Caesar's star rose, Rome grew uneasy. In particular, his former ally Pompey had begun to drift toward the Senate and the conservative optimates. With Crassus dead in the east, the triumvirate collapsed. The Senate, fearing Caesar's power and ambition, ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. Caesar refused. On a quiet winter night in 49 BCE, he led his troops across the Rubicon River, a modest stream but a monumental boundary. By crossing it with his army, an illegal act under Roman law, Caesar made a decision that would plunge the Republic into civil war. As he is said to have whispered, "Alia iacta est," the die is cast. What followed was not a short struggle, but a prolonged and global conflict. Caesar marched into Italy unopposed, as Pompey and many senators fled eastward to gather forces. The two sides would clash across the Mediterranean world, in Greece, Asia Minor, Africa, and Spain. At the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC, despite being outnumbered, Caesar defeated Pompey's forces decisively. Pompey fled to Egypt, hoping for refuge, but was instead betrayed and murdered, a severed head offered to Caesar as a gift. Caesar, upon seeing it, reportedly turned away in sorrow. He had not sought Pompey's murder, only his submission. Though the major battles were won, resistance flared across the provinces, and Caesar spent years pursuing and defeating his remaining enemies. At Thapsus, Munda, and elsewhere, he stamped out the final flames of the civil war. By 45 BCE, he returned to Rome as undisputed ruler. He accepted the title dictator for life, enacted sweeping reforms, from debt relief to calendar reform, and sought to stabilize the Republic. But beneath his rule lay a discomfort. Rome had cast off kings centuries ago, and many saw in Caesar's growing honors the shadow of monarchy returning. He was beloved by many, respected by most, but feared by a few. And in that fear, seeds were planted, for betrayal, for bloodshed, for yet another turning point in Rome's long story. By 44 BC, Julius Caesar stood alone atop the Roman world. His enemies had been defeated, his victories legendary, and his popularity among the common people immense. He had been declared Dictator Perpetuo, Dictator in Perpetuity, a title that confirmed what many already believed: the Republic had become a monarchy in all but name. And though Caesar moved through Rome with grace and outward humility, wearing no crown and offering public gestures of clemency, the old families of the Senate saw a different picture. To them, he was not a liberator, but a usurper, a man who had turned the Republic, that sacred and ancient system of shared power, into a stage for his own glory. There were whispers in the Senate halls, and behind them, an idea took root. If Caesar had become a king in everything but title, then perhaps he would soon accept even that. The final straw may have come during the Lupercalia festival, when Mark Antony, in a theatrical gesture, offered Caesar a diadem, a symbol of kingship. Caesar refused, and the crowd cheered. But to many senators watching, the performance felt like a test. Would the people have accepted a king, had Caesar taken the crown? Would they cheer louder if he tried again? And so a plot began to form, not among Caesar's enemies, but among those who had once called themselves his friends. Chief among them was Marcus Junius Brutus, a man descended from the Brutus who had helped expel Rome's last king centuries before. Caesar had trusted him deeply. He had even pardoned Brutus after the Civil War and treated him almost as a son. Another was Gaius Cassius Longinus, a stern and shrewd senator who feared Caesar's power more than he valued his favor. Around them gathered a group of more than 60 senators, calling themselves the Liberatores, the liberators. Their belief was clear: to restore the Republic, Caesar must die. The chosen day was March 15, 44 BCE, the Ides of March. That morning, Caesar was scheduled to attend a session of the Senate in the Theater of Pompey, a grand public complex where meetings were held while the Senate house was being repaired. According to legend, Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, had awoken from troubling dreams and begged him not to go. Soothsayers warned of omens, strange lights in the sky, sacrificial animals without hearts. But Caesar, ever confident, brushed them aside. He was a man of destiny. He would not be swayed by fear. When he arrived at the Senate chamber, the conspirators moved quickly. As Caesar took his seat, Tullius Cimber approached with a petition, a distraction. Then, with a suddenness that stunned all present, the attackers closed in. Knives flashed. Blows were struck. Caesar resisted at first, shielding himself, struggling to escape. But when he saw Brutus among the assailants, something in him broke. According to Suetonius, he is said to have uttered the words, "You too, Brute? You too, Brutus?" before covering his face and surrendering to fate. He fell at the base of Pompey's statue, bleeding from 23 wounds. In that moment, the greatest Roman of his time lay lifeless beneath the stone image of his once rival. A chilling tableau of the Republic's cycle of ambition and betrayal. The conspirators, believing themselves heroes, stepped out into the forum, proclaiming the death of tyranny and the return of liberty. But the reaction was not what they had imagined. The city was not jubilant. It was afraid. The common people mourned Caesar not as a tyrant, but as a generous leader, a man who had fed them, entertained them, and forgiven his enemies. His funeral, led by Mark Antony, became a moment of raw emotion. Antony read Caesar's will aloud, revealing generous gifts to the citizens of Rome and bequeathing his gardens to the public. He showed Caesar's bloodied cloak to the crowd. Grief turned to rage. A riot erupted. The conspirators fled the city, their dream of restoring the Republic already collapsing. In killing Caesar, the assassins had hoped to revive the old ways. Instead, they had shattered the final illusion that the Republic could be saved through tradition alone. In the chaos that followed, new powers would rise, and with them, a new Rome. The age of the emperors was about to begin. In the wake of Caesar's assassination, Rome did not return to harmony. Instead, the Republic he had died under the pretense of saving began to unravel even further. His murder had created a vacuum, and into that widening gap stepped three very different men, each with ambition, each with power, and each claiming the mantle of Caesar's legacy. Thus was born the Second Triumvirate, a formal, legal alliance created in 43 BC, not in shadow as the first had been, but with full constitutional authority. It brought together Octavian, Caesar's young heir, Mark Antony, Caesar's seasoned lieutenant, and Marcus Lepidus, a general and political operator who played a quieter but crucial role in stabilizing the alliance. Together, they would divide Rome's territories, punish the assassins, and rebuild the state, or so they hoped. At the center of this new triumvirate stood Gaius Octavius, known to history as Octavian and later as Augustus. Barely 19 years old when Caesar died, Octavian was Caesar's grandnephew and posthumously adopted son. Few took him seriously at first. He was young, pale, and untested. But beneath his mild exterior lay a brilliant political mind, cautious, patient, and ruthlessly calculating. He quickly raised legions, won favor with Caesar's veterans, and secured the support of many who longed for order. Antony, meanwhile, was a man of passion and charisma, a gifted orator and battle-hardened general, loved by his troops and feared by the Senate. Lepidus, older and more reserved, took charge of the western provinces and acted as a balancing presence between the two rising titans. Their first order of business was vengeance. They initiated a brutal campaign against Caesar's assassins and anyone thought to sympathize with them. Through a wave of proscriptions, legalized executions and confiscations, they purged their enemies. One of the most famous victims was Cicero, the great orator and defender of the Republic, whose head and hands were displayed publicly at Antony's command. The violence was justified as justice, but it shocked Rome. Blood had been spilled not in war, but in the name of law. The liberators, as Caesar's killers had called themselves, had fled east after the assassination, gathering support among those who still clung to the ideals of the old republic. In 42 BCE, the two sides met in Macedonia at the Battle of Philippi. There, Octavian and Antony's forces faced off against the armies of Brutus and Cassius, the leading conspirators. It was a grim, chaotic conflict, fought across marshes and broken ground. In the end, the forces of the triumvirate triumphed. Brutus and Cassius both took their own lives, and with them died the last serious attempt to restore the Republic. With their enemies vanquished, the triumvirs redivided the Roman world. Antony would rule the east, Octavian the west, and Lepidus, increasingly sidelined, was left with control of Africa. But peace would not last. Soon, the alliance began to fray under the weight of personal ambition and mistrust. Antony, now based in Alexandria, had fallen under the influence and the spell of Queen Cleopatra VII of Egypt. Their union, both romantic and political, alarmed many in Rome. They had children together, adopted regal titles, and began to speak of ruling not just Rome, but the world. To the Senate and the Roman people, this looked less like partnership and more like a monarchy in the making. A monarchy with a foreign queen at its center. Meanwhile, Octavian remained in Italy, quietly strengthening his influence. He played the role of protector of Roman values, of Caesar's legacy, and of the people's peace. With brilliant propaganda and careful alliances, he portrayed Antony as a traitor, seduced by the East, corrupted by luxury and foreign ambition. The stage was now set for a final confrontation, not merely between two men, but between two visions of Rome's future. The alliance that had once held the Roman world in balance had finally shattered. What began as a partnership between Octavian and Antony had become a rivalry marked by suspicion, ambition, and the shifting winds of public loyalty. At its heart, the conflict became more than just political. It became personal, emotional, and deeply symbolic. On one side stood Octavian, the adopted son of Julius Caesar, carefully sculpting his image as the rightful guardian of Roman tradition and stability. On the other stood Mark Antony, Caesar's former general, now inseparably linked with Cleopatra VII, Queen of Egypt, a woman admired, feared, and misunderstood across Rome. Their love affair had captivated and scandalized the Roman world. Cleopatra was no stranger to politics. She had once charmed Caesar himself, and now with Antony, she envisioned a new world, a Hellenistic Egyptian empire, powerful and independent from Rome. Together, they presented themselves not merely as monarchs, but as gods, Dionysus and Isis, Osiris and Aphrodite, rulers of East and West. Antony's will, made public by Octavian, revealed his wishes to be buried in Egypt and his grants of eastern lands to his and Cleopatra's children. For many Romans, this was the final betrayal. It seemed as though Antony had abandoned Rome entirely. Octavian moved swiftly. With the Senate's support, he declared war, not on Antony, but on Cleopatra, a shrewd political move that allowed him to frame the coming conflict as one between Rome and a foreign queen. In truth, it was a civil war in all but name. In 31 BCE, the two forces met at sea, off the western coast of Greece, near a promontory called Actium. Antony and Cleopatra commanded a large fleet, bolstered by Egyptian wealth and Eastern allies. But Octavian, advised by his brilliant admiral Marcus Agrippa, had tighter discipline, superior tactics, and the advantage of Roman naval cohesion. The Battle of Actium was as much a psychological duel as it was a military one. With tension thick in the air, and ships clashing under a blazing sun, the outcome began to tilt in Octavian's favor. Then, in a moment that has puzzled historians for centuries, Cleopatra's fleet suddenly withdrew, sailing away from the battle. Antony, caught between loyalty and strategy, chose to follow her, abandoning the fight and his men. It was the turning point. Octavian's forces closed in and secured a decisive victory. The Roman world had chosen its master. In the months that followed, Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria, where they prepared for the end. Cut off from reinforcements, their supporters gone, and Octavian's legions marching closer, they knew their time had passed. In 30 BCE, as Octavian's army breached the Egyptian capital, Antony, told falsely that Cleopatra had died, fell on his sword. Gravely wounded, he was carried to Cleopatra, where he died in her arms. Days later, she too met her end, not by Roman hand, but by her own. Legend says she used a poisonous asp, the symbol of Egypt, to end her life with dignity and defiance. When Octavian entered Alexandria, he wept at the sight of Antony's body, not just for a rival, but for the last true piece of the world that had once been Caesar's. With Cleopatra's death, the last of the Hellenistic monarchs was gone, and Egypt, rich, ancient, and proud, became a Roman province. The civil wars were over. Rome had no more rivals. And Octavian, calm and deliberate, returned home, not as a conqueror, but as a quiet architect of a new order. The Republic was no more, though its name would linger. In its place, an empire was dawning. When Octavian returned to Rome after the fall of Antony and Cleopatra, the city was weary of civil war, of shifting alliances, of blood spilled not by foreign enemies, but by Roman hands. The people yearned not for glory, but for peace. And Octavian, understanding the moment with rare clarity, did not return as a tyrant. Instead, in 27 BC, he took a step that was as brilliant as it was symbolic. He voluntarily surrendered his extraordinary powers to the Senate. In return, they granted him a new title, not king nor dictator, but Augustus, the revered one. It was a name wrapped in reverence rather than domination, a name that would echo through history. Augustus carefully preserved the illusion of the Republic. The Senate still met, magistrates were still elected, and laws still bore the appearance of shared governance. But behind the scenes, real power lay with him, as princeps, the first citizen, and commander of the legions. He became Pontifex Maximus, head of the state religion. He controlled the treasury, appointed provincial governors, and kept the loyalty of the army through steady pay and generous land grants. It was monarchy in all but name, but a monarchy cloaked in tradition, patience, and restraint. With civil wars behind him, Augustus turned his energy to rebuilding the fabric of Rome. He undertook vast reforms, touching every corner of Roman life. He restructured the army, establishing standing legions and the Praetorian Guard, a personal bodyguard that would later play fateful roles in imperial history. He passed laws to encourage marriage and childbirth, seeking to restore what he saw as the fading virtues of Roman society. He invested in grain distribution, aqueducts, roads, and public works. His building projects transformed the city. As he famously claimed, "I found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble." Augustus also oversaw the reorganization of the provinces, drawing clearer lines between senatorial and imperial control. In the east and troubled frontiers, he appointed legates loyal to him directly. In more stable regions, the Senate retained nominal oversight. The balance, though subtle, ensured that the empire remained cohesive, efficient, and, for the time, tranquil. And thus began the age known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It was not peace in the modern sense, for Rome still waged wars along its borders, from the Rhine to the deserts of Arabia. But within the empire's core, spanning from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria, there bloomed a remarkable period of relative stability, prosperity, and cultural flourishing. Trade routes were secured, piracy suppressed, and cities linked by an expanding network of roads and sea lanes. Latin and Greek languages carried ideas and customs across provinces, while Roman law began to take root far beyond the city itself. The arts, too, were nourished under Augustus. Poets such as Virgil, Horace, and Ovid crafted verses that celebrated Rome's destiny and the emperor's vision. Virgil's Aeneid, in particular, told the tale of Rome's divine origins, echoing Augustus' role as the heir to Aeneas and the guardian of fate. Temples rose in the emperor's honor, but so too did monuments to peace, like the Arapaces, the altar of peace, carved in marble with scenes of harmony, prosperity, and family. As Augustus aged, he became more contemplative. His rule had brought order after chaos, but he knew that time, even for emperors, was finite. He had no son, and his chosen heirs met untimely ends. At last, he turned to his stepson, Tiberius, to carry the mantle. When Augustus died in 14 CE, at the age of 75, the Senate deified him. The man who had ruled with calculated modesty was now Divus Augustus, a god among men. But more than his divine honors, it was the system he built that endured. The republic was gone, but the peace he crafted, sometimes fragile, sometimes firm, would shape the Roman world for generations. His reign became the quiet, golden dawn of the empire. The Roman Republic had died not with a thunderclap, but with a whisper, its final breath exhaled in the soft language of tradition. When Augustus took power, he did not call himself king. The Romans, proud of their republican heritage, would not have accepted that. Instead, he chose the title princeps, meaning first citizen. It was a term of subtle genius, modest, familiar, and yet quietly revolutionary. For in claiming to be only the first among equals, Augustus had become the first to hold all power without appearing to take it. This careful balancing act marked the beginning of what we now call the Principate, the first phase of the Roman Empire. The outward trappings of the Republic remained. The Senate still met, magistrates still wore their togas of office, and laws were still proposed and debated. But behind that familiar mask stood the emperor, wielding nearly absolute authority. Augustus held multiple powers at once: Imperium Maius, the supreme military command, Tribunicia Potestas, the powers of a tribune, allowing him to propose laws and veto others, and Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, giving him control over the state religion. These powers, layered atop one another, gave him dominion over every branch of government, judicial, military, legislative, and spiritual, without ever appearing to destroy the institutions themselves. The brilliance of this transformation lay in its gradualness. Augustus never declared the Republic dead. Instead, he preserved its language, its rituals, and even its pride, while hollowing out its independence. Senators, grateful for the restoration of order after years of civil war, accepted their diminished roles. The people, tired of chaos, embraced the peace and prosperity Augustus offered, and the army, loyal to its commander and regularly rewarded with land and pay, became the true pillar of the new regime. This new system, a republic in form, an autocracy in function, would shape the Roman state for the next 2 centuries. Emperors would continue to use the title princeps, at least until the 3rd century, preserving the illusion of shared rule. But in truth, the fate of Rome now rested in the hands of a single man at a time. And yet, the Principate was not just a political shift, it was a psychological one. Rome, long a city of debates and senatorial pride, slowly became a city of imperial dignity, where the emperor's image adorned coins, temples, and public spaces. The people no longer looked to the Forum for direction, but to the Palatine Hill, where the emperor's residence stood like a quiet symbol of stability. The transformation was, in many ways, peaceful. There were no great purges, no burning of Senate houses, no destruction of symbols. Instead, there was simply a reordering of reality, so gentle that many did not notice until the change had taken root. The Republic had given way to empire, not through conquest, but through a patient, almost parental, reshaping of authority. It was a delicate equilibrium, one that depended not just on law, but on the emperor's character. Augustus was wise, cautious, and restrained. But what of those who would follow him? Would they preserve this balance? Or would ambition and excess tear open the seams of the Principate? That, dear listener, is where our journey continues, into the reigns of the emperors who inherited Augustus' delicate creation. With the passing of Augustus in 14 CE, Rome did not fall into crisis. Instead, for the first time in its long history, the transition of supreme power passed not through civil war or political upheaval, but through a planned succession. Augustus had chosen his stepson Tiberius, a stern, experienced general, to take his place. The Senate, perhaps out of habit or perhaps because there was no other real choice, ratified him. And thus began the Julio-Claudian dynasty, a lineage shaped by the bloodlines of both Julius Caesar and Augustus' wife, Livia Drusilla. Tiberius ruled from 14 to 37 CE, and though he was a capable administrator and a skilled military leader, his reign was marked by growing paranoia and withdrawal. He was never beloved, and as the years passed, he became increasingly reclusive, retreating from public life to the island of Capri, where rumors of dark indulgence and cruelty began to swirl. Still, the empire remained stable. The institutions Augustus built held firm, and the machinery of government continued to turn. But beneath the surface, unease was growing. His successor was his grandnephew and adopted grandson, Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known by his childhood nickname, Caligula. At first, his reign, beginning in 37 CE, was greeted with joy. Caligula was young, charismatic, and the son of a beloved general. But soon, his behavior turned erratic and then disturbing. Whether due to illness or a deeper instability, he began to treat himself not just as emperor, but as a living god, erecting statues of himself in temples, mocking the Senate, and indulging in spectacles of cruelty. He declared his horse Incitatus a priest, and possibly even intended to make him a consul. The Principate, once restrained under Augustus, was now being stretched to its breaking point. In 41 CE, after less than 4 years in power, Caligula was assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard, a clear sign that even emperors were not untouchable. The next ruler, surprisingly, was not a general or a statesman, but Claudius, Caligula's uncle. Thought by many to be weak or even dim-witted due to a lifelong stammer and limp, Claudius proved to be a thoughtful and effective emperor. He expanded the empire into Britain, reformed the bureaucracy, and strengthened the legal system. His reign, from 41 to 54 CE, restored a measure of dignity to the dynasty. Yet he, too, was not free from court intrigues. He was heavily influenced by his wives and freedmen, and it is widely believed that his fourth wife, Agrippina the Younger, poisoned him to ensure the succession of her own son, Nero. And Nero, Nero. His name would come to symbolize the excesses of absolute power. He began his reign at just 17 years old in 54 CE, with promise and artistic flair. Under the guidance of wise advisors like Seneca, his early rule showed balance. But over time, Nero shed his advisors and gave into vanity, indulgence, and paranoia. He fancied himself a poet, a charioteer, and a performer, not just in private, but on public stages. He taxed the empire heavily to fund his building projects and performances. When a great fire consumed Rome in 64 CE, Nero was accused of indifference. Some even